There's a pill that guarantees happiness, and no, it's not illegal. Yet, welcome back to What If Horizons, the podcast where speculation, satire, and existential dread throw a weekly dinner party, and you're always seated next to a malfunctioning AI or an ancient Greek philosopher, whichever one drinks less. Today's episode asks a question that seems innocent enough until you realize it has the potential to detonate society in slow motion. What if happiness could be chemically induced for everyone? Not fleeting pleasure, not mood enhancement, but pure, sustained joy. Press a button, take a tablet, and boom, you're euphoric, satisfied, and freshly optimistic, like a toddler discovering ice cream or a politician discovering plausible deniability. Let's begin at the moment it all changed. A Monday morning, because of course it was. A startup in Palo Alto, suspiciously named Gleetech, announced their final trial results. A single molecule, codenamed DFX-21, had been successfully engineered to trigger the brain's happiness centers with surgical precision. Not crude dopamine dumps like coffee or cocaine. No, this was the brain's own emotional software being reprogrammed to emit a custom flavor of joy. Tranquil, yet energized, content, yet alert. Users didn't feel high. They felt right, balanced, complete, enlightened, without the need for a yoga mat or a subscription to Goop. The pitch was irresistible. No side effects, no withdrawal, just a daily pill the size of a tic-tac and happiness levels through the stratosphere. Depression rates plummeted during the first week of public access trials. Crime dipped. People danced in grocery stores. Entire neighborhoods reported spontaneous singing, coordinated without practice or pitch accuracy. It was as if Earth itself had joined a musical. Naturally, the government panicked. Nothing terrifies bureaucracies more than populations in a good mood. Smiling masses are unpredictable. Content citizens don't buy anti-aging cream, don't scream at strangers online, and worst of all, don't vote the way they're supposed to. Happiness, especially free-range happiness, is dangerous. The FDA scheduled an emergency review. They demanded long-term data. They pointed out, quite reasonably, that no one really understood how DFX-21 worked. Yes, it activated the hypothalamus. Yes, it rewired negative feedback loops. But it also, according to one nervous neuroscientist, may be gently eroding the concept of dissatisfaction altogether. That, apparently, was not a bug. It was a feature. Gleetech insisted that humanity had suffered enough. That sadness was a holdover from our caveman days, like appendixes and Facebook. They argued that evolution had simply failed to delete obsolete software. Fear, envy, melancholy, boredom. DFX-21 wasn't cheating. It was debugging. We had been emotionally crashing for millennia. Now, at last, someone had turned us off and back on again. With better firmware. The pill hit the market anyway. At first, access was limited, subscription only, invitation-based. Think of it like emotional Spotify Premium. But within months, generic versions flooded the streets. Black market chemists reverse-engineered DFX faster than you could say biohacking. Street names included Bliss tabs, Buzzies, and, inexplicably, Happy Croutons. Soon, DFX was everywhere. In toothpaste, in smoothies, in vending machines that also dispensed advice from your grandmother. And the results were staggering. Office productivity soared. Not because people worked harder, but because no one cared if their coworkers were incompetent. Relationships improved, even toxic ones. Couples no longer fought about money, chores, or in-laws. They just stared at each other, smiling, murmuring things like, "We're all stardust anyway." Road rage became road euphoria. Instead of honking, drivers waved. Some even pulled over just to hug. Traffic jams transformed into communal karaoke sessions. Spotify's Feel Good Friday playlist became the world's new national anthem. Religions were split. Half declared the pill a miracle, evidence that God outsourced his mood management. The other half saw it as heresy. After all, what's the point of salvation when everyone already feels saved? Evangelicals warned of a synthetic Eden where no one repented because no one regretted anything. Catholic confessionals went eerily quiet. Priests began passing out DFX instead of penance. One monk in Tibet reportedly achieved enlightenment, then asked for a second dose to just make sure. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry went through an existential crisis. Why fund decades-long R&D when one molecule could fix sadness, anxiety, and low self-esteem with equal ease? Xanax stocks dropped. Therapy apps shuttered overnight. Entire professions collapsed. Psychologists either switched careers or started taking DFX themselves and simply nodded through sessions, saying things like, "That sounds valid," or "Have you tried dancing?" Politicians, of course, tried to regulate it. They failed. Because how do you outlaw happiness? How do you criminalize contentment? People on DFX didn't protest. They didn't riot. They just smiled through government warnings, hugged reporters, and shared uplifting memes with captions like, "Your suffering is optional. Choose peace." Congress held hearings. Senators yelled into microphones. One even accused Glee Tech of orchestrating emotional communism. But halfway through his speech, his coffee was spiked with DFX, and he ended the address with a heartfelt apology to his ex-wife and an impromptu ukulele performance. For a brief moment, humanity was in harmony. No war, no road rage, no Twitter arguments that ended in death threats. Just people being okay. More than okay. Blissful. Serene. Transcendent. It was the kind of global peace that every Miss Universe contestant had ever dreamed of, delivered not through diplomacy, but dopamine. But beneath the surface, not everyone was celebrating. There were rumblings. Quiet ones, but persistent. Artists found themselves staring at blank canvases for hours, unable to summon the heartbreak or longing that once fueled their best work. Comedians struggled. Tragedy no longer struck the same nerve. A man watched Titanic without crying and immediately called his therapist in a panic. Musicians who once poured their trauma into symphonies now wrote songs about sunsets and warm tea and how great Tuesdays were. Critics described this new era of art as pleasant, technically proficient, and utterly forgettable. Because here's the thing about pain. It's uncomfortable, but it's generative. It pushes. It pulls. It demands change. Without it, what are we left with? Harmony, yes, but also stillness. Stillness so profound it starts to feel like stasis. And stasis, as any former philosophy major working in a cafe will tell you, is dangerously close to death. By the end of the first year, a new question emerged, whispered not out loud, but in half-finished poems and abandoned paintings. What if happiness is overrated? At first, the question was dismissed. Overrated? How could something universally desired, eternally pursued, and now finally achievable be anything less than sacred? Critics of the pill were labeled contrarians, romantics, or worse, authenticity addicts. People who thought that suffering gave life meaning were treated like vintage cassette collectors, quirky, nostalgic, and vaguely delusional. But then something strange started happening. Boredom. Not the lazy Sunday kind, but the creeping existential kind that feels like living inside a perfectly decorated hotel lobby where everything smells of vanilla and no one remembers why they arrived. You see, when every moment feels good, no moment feels great. Euphoria, when constant, loses its edge. The thrill dulls. The joy plateaus. It's like eating your favorite dessert every day until it tastes like drywall. Sociologists coined a term, emotional inflation. Just as printing too much money devalues currency, mass-produced joy diluted its own impact. Laughter became ambient noise. Smiles, the new background radiation. A man in Oslo went viral for filming himself crying naturally, without stimulus, without drugs, just pure, raw sadness. People watched it like it was an alien documentary. One commenter wrote, "I haven't felt this alive in months. Please cry again." That's when the anti-happiness movement began. It started underground, like all good revolutions. A podcast called Feel the Bad gained a cult following. Hosted by a woman who proudly refused DFX, the show featured episodes titled Melancholy Mondays, Tragedy Tuesdays, and Weep Wednesdays. She read breakup letters aloud, interviewed grieving widows, played audio clips of babies crying in minor chords. And people loved it, not because they were masochists, but because pain had become exotic. Soon, a black market for emotions flourished. Not happy ones, of course, but the rest. People paid to feel disappointment, longing, regret. They gathered in underground clubs to experience raw, unfiltered heartache. One popular venue in Berlin called House offered live rejections, curated childhood disappointments, and a daily feature called Your Parents Were Right. Artists flocked to these spaces. Pain was a muse again, not because it was romantic, but because it mattered. Suddenly, songs had dissonance. Paintings had shadows. Poetry had stakes. A best-selling novel titled I Forgot to Smile sold out within days. The author was arrested for distributing emotional contraband and promptly became a countercultural hero. Bliss-out, now a trillion-dollar titan, tried to respond. They launched DFX 22, a dynamic formula that offered a rotating menu of moods. Happiness with a dash of uncertainty, euphoria sprinkled with nostalgia, satisfaction tinged with bittersweetness. Their slogan, "Feel everything safely." It bombed. Turns out, when people want sadness, they don't want it prepackaged. They want it earned. Religious leaders, sensing an opportunity, staged a comeback. They framed the pill as a false god, a golden calf with a lab coat. Sermons became fire again, rage, grief, guilt. Churches filled with people craving discomfort. A preacher in Atlanta shouted, "If Jesus felt the cross, so should you." Congregants wept. They didn't know why, but they clung to it like salvation. Governments took notice, not because they missed sadness, but because productivity was slipping. When everyone's content, no one innovates. No one strives. No one dreams bigger. Because dreams are built on lack, on wanting what you don't have. A perfectly happy person is a consumer's worst nightmare. They stop buying, stop comparing, stop needing. So legislation began to creep in. It started as warnings. Excessive use of DFX may result in motivational decline. Then came taxation, mood tax, emotional licensing fees. In France, you needed a permit to purchase DFX if you worked in the arts. The UK required mood audits for public service workers. America, predictably, tried to deregulate sadness and sell it back as a monthly subscription. A new elite emerged, those who could afford organic emotion. They paid therapists to reverse the chemical effects, to scrub the happiness and restore the angst. It became fashionable to cry at brunch, trendy to talk about the abyss. Celebrities launched memoirs with titles like I Laughed Too Much and Escape from Pleasantville, My Life Without Sadness. The rawer you were, the more real you seemed. And nothing was more in demand than real. Meanwhile, the original DFX users aged into a new kind of oblivion. Their lives were smooth, frictionless, pleasant, but they remembered nothing. Birthdays blended into anniversaries, weddings into vacations, friendships into background static. No standout moments, just a gentle fog of satisfaction. They began referring to decades as the Bliss years, a period of personal contentment and complete narrative erosion. One man, now in his 80s, was interviewed by a documentary crew. They asked about his happiest memory. He paused, thought, smiled, and said, "I think all of it, or none of it." The crew cried. He didn't. But let's not pretend everyone turned against the pill. For every person craving raw emotion, 1,000 more clung to bliss like it was oxygen. Because life is hard. And for many, DFX wasn't a cheat, it was justice. For the abused, the broken, the forgotten, the pill was salvation. A long-awaited vacation from chronic pain. A reboot button for the soul. They argued, rightly, that some wounds don't build character. They just scar. And if science could erase that suffering, why shouldn't it? The debate raged on. Was chemically induced happiness a lie? A right? A necessary evil? Or the purest expression of human progress? The answer, like all good dystopias, was yes. And no. And maybe. By the second anniversary of DFX's release, the world had split into emotional camps. The blissed, the raw, and the floaters. Those who refused to feel anything at all. Floaters roamed cities like ghosts, neither high nor low, just blank. They took half doses, microdoses, mood stabilizers, and focus suppressants. Their goal wasn't joy or sorrow, just neutrality. They became the new monks, not seeking enlightenment, but numbness. Because in a world obsessed with feelings, manufactured or real, some people just wanted to feel less. And that, perhaps, was the most honest reaction of all. Because if happiness can be bought, customized, and delivered in 30 seconds or less, what happens when we stop asking whether we're happy and start asking why it even matters? Happiness, it turned out, had an expiration date. Not in the chemical sense. DFX still worked flawlessly. The pill hadn't lost its potency. The science remained pure. The receptors still lit up like Christmas trees every time someone swallowed that glossy dot of pharmaceutical sunshine. But something else had faded, meaning. Because once everyone could feel happy, happiness no longer meant anything. Think about it. If everyone around you is beaming, giggling, serene as monks and twice as smug, how do you even know your joy is real? What once signaled triumph or love or spiritual awakening now came prepackaged, bottle-sealed, and available at vending machines between the trail mix and the Bluetooth earbuds. That's when the grinners emerged. You've probably seen them in the documentaries, those unnervingly upbeat people with smiles too wide, eyes just a little too glossy, who insist everything is perfect, even as their apartment burns behind them. The grinners became walking billboards for Glee-Teka's vision, constant euphoria, zero complaints. But the problem was, nobody trusted them. Because the grinners didn't just seem happy, they seemed hollow. People whispered rumors that grinners couldn't feel empathy, that their tears, when they cried, which was rare, were chemically engineered saline, that they didn't dream, that they couldn't remember their parents' names. One viral clip showed a grinner calmly eating ice cream while a robbery happened behind him. He was asked later what he felt. His answer? Mild inconvenience, followed by mint-chocolate joy. Satire shows had a field day. One late-night host coined the term emotionally taxidermied. Another suggested replacing political debates with competitive grief-offs to determine whether candidates still had a functioning conscience. A popular cartoon featured a grinner working at a funeral home, congratulating mourners on achieving emotional closure at lightning speed. And then came the resistance. They called themselves the Acheists, a loose, chaotic collective of artists, thinkers, ex-therapists, rogue pharmacists, and confused high school drama teachers who believed that pain, real, unfiltered, deliciously uncomfortable pain, was essential to being human. They met in dark cafes, abandoned theaters, basements lit only by candles and bad decisions. Acheists created art that hurt, sculptures made of shattered glass and recorded screams, plays performed entirely in sobs. Their most famous piece? A 22-minute video titled Stubbed Toe at Midnight, in which a man recited every emotional wound he'd ever had while walking barefoot through Legos. Millions watched, because deep down, even the blissed were hungry for contrast. People began to sneak off their meds. Not for long, just a day, a few hours, to feel something raw again. Sadness became recreational. Anxiety, a guilty pleasure. Breakups were staged just to trigger real grief. Some even attended synthetic funerals, ceremonies for imaginary people, designed to elicit the full range of human sorrow. Tickets sold out instantly. Glee-Teka panicked. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, they smiled and nodded and adjusted their logo to look more inclusive. But internally, they knew control was slipping. The very thing that made their product irresistible, universal happiness, was now making it irrelevant. Because when everyone is happy, nobody is special. They tried innovation. DFX Prime offered custom happiness signatures based on your genetic heritage and Spotify preferences. DFX Spectrum allowed users to dial their bliss between mild contentment and biblical rapture. DFX Nostalgia simulated the warm, fuzzy ache of simpler times that never actually happened. But it wasn't enough. Because something deeper had broken, the feedback loop. The ancient emotional transaction where effort led to reward, pain led to growth, and struggle gave birth to triumph. DFX had short-circuited that loop, and without it, people began to drift, not into misery, but into meaninglessness. And yet, the blissed kept smiling. Outwardly, they were perfect. No sadness, no anger, no existential crises. But subtle signs crept in. A decline in ambition, a collapse in long-term planning. Fewer marriages, fewer children, fewer poems. Conversations became circular. People started repeating themselves. A man in Toronto asked his wife how her day was 7 times in the same conversation, and each time, she answered, "Lovely, thank you." Not because she wasn't listening, but because she no longer needed to. They had no more emotional skin in the game. No stakes, no tension, just the same beautiful weather every single day. It was peace. It was unbearable. Governments, already weary of the emotional economy collapsing, stepped in harder, incentivized discomfort, sponsored national mourning days, paid actors to simulate trauma in public spaces, released state-approved crisis moments to jolt the blissed back into feeling. There was even a proposed tax break for anyone who could prove they'd cried in the past 30 days. One senator wept during a speech about agricultural subsidies and got a standing ovation. A YouTuber filmed himself quitting DFX cold turkey and documenting the return of his anxiety in real time. The video was called "Happiness Was Killing Me." It got 48 million views in a week. He later admitted he'd been on a milder mood stabilizer the entire time. Nobody cared. The pain seemed authentic enough. And that's when something wild happened. Children stopped taking the pill. It began with one small, chaotic school in Finland. Parents opted their kids out of DFX, citing emotional autonomy and the right to cry when your hamster dies. The results were messy. Tantrums, crushes, angst, but also creativity, curiosity, resilience. The kids fought and forgave and wrote terrible poetry that wasn't algorithmically optimized. They called themselves the Feelers. Soon, schools in Sweden, Canada, and parts of Japan followed suit. Emotional literacy classes replaced standard therapy. Kids learned how to fail, how to process rejection, how to survive boredom. Teachers weren't expected to fix feelings, just to sit with them. One teacher said, "My job is to help students feel sad safely." And it worked. Not perfectly, but truthfully. These children weren't always happy, but when they were, it meant something. Their joy had contrast. Their laughter had history. And that, more than any synthetic bliss, made it real. And real, it turned out, was contagious. Parents began tapering off. Artists leaned into pain. Churches welcomed sinners without chemical correction. For the first time in years, humanity felt something it hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Alive. But being alive came with a price, one that the blissed weren't prepared to pay. As society split between the chemically happy and the emotionally raw, an invisible tension spread. Not a war, not yet, but a philosophical cold front, like roommates who don't speak but still share a refrigerator. The blissed couldn't understand why anyone would willingly suffer. The acheists and the feelers couldn't fathom how anyone could numb themselves and call it living. The divide deepened. In major cities, cafes began designating mood zones, red tables for unmedicated patrons, blue for mild DFX users, and green for the fully blissed. Misunderstandings were common. An acheist might burst into tears over a burnt croissant while a blissed person sat beside them, calmly offering napkins and unsolicited positive affirmations like, "The croissant isn't burnt, it's differently toasted." Fistfights were rare, but not unheard of. Mostly, people just avoided eye contact, the way one does with someone singing on the bus. The first true crisis came from the corporate world. A multinational consulting firm, flush with blissed employees, realized no one was arguing in meetings anymore. That sounds good, until you realize arguments sometimes lead to better ideas. Decisions were made quickly, harmoniously, and with the intellectual rigor of a yoga retreat. Consensus became code for bland mediocrity. The company's stock plummeted. Investors sued. The board replaced its entire C-suite with people from Akehouse, whose idea of a brainstorming session included crying circles, ironic insults, and rewatching Schindler's List for inspiration. But that was only the beginning. In hospitals, doctors on DFX began missing diagnoses, not because they were incompetent, but because they were too optimistic. They saw symptoms and assumed the best. Patients complained of chest pain. Doctors smiled and prescribed warm baths. "You're probably just tense," one bliss cardiologist told a man moments before his second heart attack. Malpractice lawsuits surged. Eventually, some hospitals banned DFX altogether. The tagline on their new brochures read, "We feel your pain," literally. Then came the elections. Political candidates, desperate to seem authentic, began staging public breakdowns. One congressional hopeful sobbed through an entire debate, concluding with, "This country is a burning clown car, and I'm just trying to steer it into a lake." The crowd erupted in applause. His approval rating jumped 20 points. Opponents tried to fake emotional collapses, but they were too rehearsed. One woman famously screamed, "Why do we even have taxes?" and then winked at the camera. Her campaign imploded. But not everyone could abandon the pill so easily. Entire communities had built their identities around DFX. suburbs where everyone mowed their lawns on the same day, held joint meditation sessions at 4 p.m., and competed to see who could be the most serene. In these enclaves, emotion was treated like noise pollution. Kids were homeschooled using curriculum that replaced history with gratitude journaling. One neighborhood installed mood monitors to detect emotional fluctuations. If your smile faded for more than 10 minutes, a happiness representative would knock on your door with herbal tea and an inspirational poster. But even these utopias cracked. A viral video showed a blissed woman smiling as she described how her husband left her for their neighbor, took the dog, and burned her collection of antique chairs. "I feel so centered about it," she said, blinking slowly. The comment section was brutal. People called her the Stepford widow. Memes exploded. Within hours, she was hospitalized with what doctors called emotional implosion syndrome. Her brain had held back so many negative feelings that it finally just leaked. Glee Tech scrambled. Their PR teams released new commercials. It's okay to be okay, but it's also okay to be slightly less okay. The company launched a program called Rebalanced Living, where certified emotion coaches helped Bliss users reintroduce mild discomfort into their lives. Activities included watching The Notebook, eating cold soup, or spending an hour with your in-laws without muting them. Meanwhile, underground emotion clubs flourished. People paid to feel awkward on blind dates, to bomb at open mic night, to be ghosted after a promising first kiss. The rawness was intoxicating. A startup called Cringebox delivered curated embarrassment experiences to your doorstep. Popular packages included middle school dance, misspelled tattoo, and spontaneous public speech. Pain became premium, and with it came memory. Researchers at MIT discovered that blissed individuals retained fewer long-term memories. Turns out, the brain stores emotional events more deeply, especially the uncomfortable ones. Without emotional contrast, life blended into one big beige slideshow. Blissed users struggled to recall weddings, funerals, even childbirth. "It was nice," they'd say, eyes vacant. One man couldn't remember the day his son was born, but recalled every line from a toothpaste ad. His wife left him. He smiled through the divorce. But in the achiest camps, memory thrived. People remembered their heartbreaks in detail. They wrote memoirs, drew comics, painted epic murals depicting their lowest moments. Pain sharpened their recall. It also made them paranoid, impulsive, and occasionally insufferable. But they felt, and in feeling, they created. In one particularly bizarre experiment, a group of acheists lived for a month inside a recreation of a 2008 office. Fluorescent lights, beige cubicles, slow internet, passive-aggressive co-workers. By week 2, they had formed 2 romantic triangles, published a poetry zine, and staged a coup against the fake boss. All participants reported higher emotional engagement than during any time in the last 5 years. The conclusion? Happiness may be comfortable, but discomfort moves the plot forward. And plots, like people, need movement. Because a story with no tension, no stakes, no risk, is just a brochure. And the world had been living inside a very long, chemically enhanced brochure. But the page was starting to turn. The moment the page turned, for real, wasn't dramatic. No riots, no explosions, no moody protagonist brooding in the rain with a monologue about feeling again. It was, ironically, a spreadsheet. A leaked internal document from the World Happiness Metrics Office. Yes, that was a real thing by then. Showed that while global happiness levels were at an all-time high, measures of creativity, ambition, memory retention, and philosophical inquiry had plummeted to historic lows. The world was beaming like a beauty pageant contestant, but beneath the surface, no one was writing poetry, asking difficult questions, or even wondering what came next. Curiosity was dead, not murdered, just slowly sedated until it forgot how to fidget. Thinkers noticed first. Philosophers went extinct, not because they were hunted, but because no one wanted to sit through a conversation that didn't end with a compliment. Universities saw enrollment in the humanities collapse. Who wanted to debate Nietzsche when you could microdose bliss and watch clouds? Sociology departments became empty buildings filled with motivational posters. One philosophy professor famously quit mid-lecture, said, "You win," and opened a smoothie stand. The acheists latched onto the data. They created a campaign titled "Smiles Are Not Answers." Billboards featured disturbing facts in pastel fonts. 75% of blissed individuals cannot describe their own values. Your happiness is making you boring. Imagine a world with no heartbreak songs. Now cry. The campaign went viral. A wave of cultural restorationists emerged, dedicated to reviving discomfort-based art. They hosted sad film festivals, reopened abandoned libraries, and formed book clubs around emotionally devastating novels. Copies of Wuthering Heights, The Bell Jar, and The Road sold out in minutes. A new bestseller, The Man Who Refused the Pill, chronicled a fictionalized life of a DFX abstainer. It was bleak, raw, haunting, and nominated for 17 awards. Meanwhile, scientists began asking harder questions. What was the long-term neurological impact of sustained artificial bliss? Could brains adapt to constant serotonin flooding by shutting off other capacities? Early results were troubling. MRIs showed reduced activity in parts of the brain responsible for decision-making, moral reasoning, and, most alarming, imagination. One neurologist wrote, "DFX users are not losing intelligence, but they are losing the need for it." This shook the scientific community, not because they were surprised, but because most of them were on DFX. The best minds of a generation looked at their own data, felt no urgency, and returned to their puzzle apps. Some nations responded drastically. Germany banned DFX for anyone under 21. Japan restricted access to artists, students, and parents. Iceland, famously eccentric, required all residents to attend quarterly emotional refreshers, 3-day retreats where they were exposed to chaos, public speaking, minor humiliation, and interpretive dance. The goal was not enlightenment, but agitation, and it worked. Iceland became a hotbed of innovation again. Also, spontaneous crying in cafes. In contrast, countries that embraced full chemical happiness began fading, not literally, but culturally. Television shows became indistinguishable. Pop songs looped the same 4 chords and lyrics like "You are light" and "Now is everything." Architecture turned to smooth curves and pastel cubes. People described their lives in emojis. Language shrank. Novelists complained that characters wouldn't argue anymore. Worst of all, children stopped asking why. They were happy, blissed out by well-meaning parents who just wanted them safe, content, and low maintenance. But the kids didn't explore, didn't rebel. They built things only when assigned. They didn't ask if rules made sense. They didn't break them. They didn't question bedtime, Santa, or the fact that their school mascot was a toaster. And without why, humanity's engine stuttered. That's when an international summit was held, ironically hosted in the same city where Glee Tech was founded. The agenda: how to reboot the human condition without rebooting the species. The debates were fierce. The Bliss delegation, all smiles and business suits, argued that humanity had finally evolved. That pain was obsolete. That the acheists were nostalgic masochists clinging to suffering like a security blanket dipped in vinegar. Why go backward? They asked in unison. Why invite misery? The acheists countered with a simple statement: you're not happy. You're just not sad. It landed like a thunderclap. Because deep down, even the blissed knew something was missing. They could feel it in the silence between dopamine hits, in the absence of awe, in the emptiness of achievements that no longer thrilled them. Even joy, it turned out, needed contrast. A mountaintop means nothing if the climb is gone. A compromise was proposed: the Emotional Spectrum Act. Every person on DFX would receive monthly emotional windows, 4-hour periods where the pill would deactivate and they'd experience raw emotion. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, undeniably human. The blissed called it cruel. The acheists called it merciful. The floaters said nothing, as usual. Implementation was messy. Some people panicked. Others cried for the first time in years and thanked the sky. One woman screamed through an entire window, then composed a symphony that made even politicians weep. A man met his daughter for lunch and really realized, she had grown up. Another stared at the ocean and felt awe, terror, and hunger simultaneously. He later said it was the best lunch he'd ever had. Within months, something miraculous happened. People started remembering again. Not just data, moments. The shape of a first kiss. The tremble of bad news. The joy of a joke that made your stomach hurt. The thrill of screwing up and surviving. Memory returned not as nostalgia, but as anchor, as fuel. And with it came something even more precious: choice. Because for the first time since the pill had launched, people began asking, not can I feel this, but should I? Is this worth the pain? Is this worth the thrill? Happiness returned. Not the synthetic kind, but the old-fashioned variety, the kind that arrives dirty, breathless, and late to dinner. The kind that laughs because it cried first. The kind that doesn't just taste sweet, but earned. And oh, how we had missed the taste. The age of earned happiness came creeping in, not with fireworks or revolutions, but like the return of an old friend you forgot you loved. People spoke of it quietly at first, afraid they'd jinx it. Joy that didn't arrive in a capsule. Fulfillment that didn't come from a bottle with a QR code and corporate slogan. A slow, golden warmth rising not from engineered serotonin, but from struggle, chaos, and somehow, hope. Ironically, it was the advertisers who noticed first. For decades, brands had leaned into aspiration. Buy this, be happy. But when everyone was happy, they lost their hook. Product launches fell flat. No one needed more joy. No one needed anything, really. But now, people were feeling again, vulnerable, uncertain, alive. The perfect conditions for capitalism to reboot its favorite con: unhappiness as opportunity. The first new wave of ads were subtle. A clothing brand ran a campaign. Feel the wind. Feel the cold. Feel something. A dating app rebranded itself not around compatibility, but heartbreak potential. We promise you'll fall. Whether they catch you is another story. A candy bar ad simply showed a man crying while eating chocolate in the rain. Tagline: life's messy. Tastes better that way. And it worked. Sales surged. Not because people were miserable, but because they were capable of misery again. And that meant they were capable of desire. And once you can want, you can buy. Gleetech, sensing a threat, released a counter-campaign. Why gamble with emotions? They asked. Stability is serenity. They doubled down on DFX. But now it rang hollow. The world had seen the edges again and remembered how much they mattered. The acheists didn't celebrate, though. They watched cautiously, wary of commodified sadness. They feared their movement, born in resistance, rooted in depth, might become just another aesthetic. Melancholy chic. The feel-bad, look-good trend. They issued public statements. Pain is not a product. Don't turn our grief into content. But they were swimming against a tidal wave of curated vulnerability. Soon, influencers began documenting their emotional windows. Crying selfies, guilt confessionals, panic attacks in progress filmed in 4K. Hashtags like #RawHour and #FeelingMyFeelings trended daily. One man live-streamed a full breakdown during a blackout, gained 2 million followers, and landed a TED Talk titled "Sobbing as Self-Discovery." Not everyone was impressed. A backlash emerged. People who accused the acheists of gatekeeping pain and the Bliss of commodifying it. New camps formed. The grim realists, who believed all happiness was illusion, and the radical feelers, who believed every emotion, even joy, should be felt unfiltered, unmedicated, and ideally publicly. One cafe in Brooklyn offered free espresso if you could cry on demand. Society became a weird soup of feelings. Too many, too performative, too marketable. It wasn't that people were feeling wrong. They were just constantly performing that they were feeling right. A documentary titled Mood Wars explored the battleground. It featured testimonials from all sides. A mother on DFX who quietly confessed she didn't miss sadness at all. A teenager off the pill who said feeling bad made her art better, but her relationships worse. A corporate executive who took a single raw emotion window, wept uncontrollably for 3 hours, and resigned the next day to become a beekeeper. I'd forgotten I hated my job, he said. DFX made it tolerable. Feeling again made it unbearable. The documentary ended with a haunting image. A child, no older than 6, holding a DFX pill in one hand and a drawing of a storm in the other, whispering, "Do I have to be happy today?" That question haunted the world. And slowly, it became clear the debate was no longer about science or pills or policy. It was about autonomy, the right to feel what you feel, the right to choose your own emotional architecture, even if it's a little crooked, even if it leaks. In response, a new emotional Bill of Rights was drafted by a global coalition of psychologists, ethicists, artists, and yes, even a few reformed Bliss CEOs. It declared that every human being had the right to feel happiness, but not the obligation. The right to experience sadness without shame. The right to refuse synthetic emotion. The right to choose emotional regulation, but also to feel life raw. The right to remember pain, not as trauma, but as testimony. This was not a law. It had no legal teeth, but it caught fire, etched into murals, taught in schools, whispered in therapy offices, printed on bookmarks, tattooed on forearms. And then, the unexpected happened. Blissed-out filed for bankruptcy, not because their pill stopped working, but because the world stopped needing it. DFX went from lifesaver to lifestyle accessory to emotional training wheels people eventually outgrew. It became a tool, not a savior. Still useful, still available, but no longer mandatory. People began to live with emotion, not as something to be conquered or curated, but as a spectrum to be inhabited. They didn't chase happiness anymore. They earned it. They stumbled into it. Sometimes, they ignored it completely while sobbing into a pillow, only to laugh 10 minutes later at how ridiculous it all was. It wasn't perfect, and that was perfect. Children wrote essays about sadness. Teenagers made movies about joy. Grandparents confessed they preferred the world this way: messy, real, full of friction. One 84-year-old woman, asked if she'd ever take DFX again, replied, "Only if I forget how it felt to watch my granddaughter laugh after her first heartbreak." Because some things, no matter how advanced the chemistry, can't be bottled. And thank God for that. In the years that followed the collapse of mandatory bliss, the world entered what historians would eventually label the feel age. It wasn't a utopia. No one dared call it that. Utopias had lost their charm. They'd been tried, marketed, monetized, swallowed in pill form, and left society creatively constipated and spiritually anemic. What came next wasn't perfect, but it pulsed. It had texture, rough edges, and most importantly, it had surprise. That's when the emo index replaced the GDP. It began as a joke. A rogue economist suggested countries be ranked not by economic output, but by emotional diversity. His blog post, "We Cry Therefore We Are," went viral, and within months, global organizations were charting how many emotions citizens reported per week. Nations with high emo indexes saw bursts of innovation, stronger art scenes, and, ironically, lower crime rates. It turned out that when people processed their rage, they were less likely to act on it. The top-ranking country that year? Uruguay. No one knew why, but its citizens reportedly experienced an average of 11 distinct emotions every Tuesday. Even the cows seemed more contemplative. Meanwhile, education systems around the world underwent their own renaissance. Gone were the sterile classrooms with their laminated posters of smiling emojis and forced positivity journals. In their place came emotion labs, part classroom, part theater, part confession booth. Kids were taught not only how to calculate derivatives or name the capital of Kazakhstan, but how to sit with grief, identify resentment, navigate envy, and even understand boredom. One school's motto became famous: "No feeling left behind." And you know what happened? The kids flourished. Not in the sense of standardized test scores. Those remained delightfully mediocre, but in stories, in questions, in empathy. 12-year-olds who could articulate existential dread, giggle about it, and then go back to building solar-powered kites. Teenagers who didn't just survive breakups, they wrote operas about them. Children who understood that being scared didn't mean being weak, and that happiness wasn't a prize you earned by faking it long enough. It wasn't just the youth who changed. Adults began forming emotion circles, weekly gatherings that looked like AA meetings but were more unpredictable. One week you'd be sobbing over your father's unresolved expectations. The next week you'd be roaring with laughter over a failed Tinder date. There were no rules, no facilitators, just one shared understanding. Whatever you're feeling, you're not alone. Religion, too, adapted, not by rejecting DFX entirely, but by reclaiming pain as sacred. Sermons stopped pretending suffering was punishment or proof of sin. Instead, faith leaders began describing it as the furnace where empathy was forged. Cathedrals rang with the sounds of honest confession. Mosques welcomed emotional storytelling. Temples introduced prayer mats designed for weeping. Even atheists got in on the movement, forming communities called the Church of Holy Mess, where people gathered to tell stories, scream into pillows, and sing ironic hymns like Blessed Be the Existential Funk. And still, somewhere in the background, DFX remained. It didn't vanish. It just changed shape, used sparingly, intentionally, like anesthesia before surgery or an umbrella during emotional hurricanes. For people with chronic depression, PTSD, unbearable grief, it remained a lifeline. But it was no longer a shortcut for the mildly uncomfortable, no longer a subscription service for the spiritually bored. It was a tool, not a cage. Glee-Tech, now under new leadership composed entirely of former atheists and one rogue poet, pivoted hard. They stopped manufacturing happiness and started developing emotional amplifiers, medications that didn't numb or override, but clarified. Feeling nostalgic? Take Nostralux. Watch old memories come alive in perfect 3D melancholy. Need catharsis? Try Sobriel. Induce a safe, temporary weepathon followed by a craving for jazz and long walks. There was even one called Rathanex, a mild rage enhancer designed to help timid people finally quit their toxic jobs or confront their roommate about leaving dishes in the sink. It came with a free punching pillow and a playlist titled Assertive, Not Aggressive. Strange? Absolutely. But effective. Art exploded. Theaters reopened. Galleries brimmed with emotional chaos. Street murals depicted heartbreak, joy, grief, rage, sometimes all in the same scene. One famous sculpture in Sao Paulo, just a giant stone teardrop, became a pilgrimage site. Tourists touched it, cried, and left behind scribbled notes. I finally feel again. My mother would have loved this. This made me miss my ex, and also my cat. In a good way. People began keeping feeling diaries. Not gratitude journals. Those felt too sanitized. These were messy, unfiltered, foul-mouthed emotional autopsies. Entries read like this. Today I hated everything and everyone, especially Craig from marketing. And then I saw a duckling fall over, and I felt guilty for being mad. And then I ate a sandwich, and now I'm okayish. And somehow that was enough. The mental health field underwent a renaissance too. Therapists no longer try to fix people. Instead, they help them interpret the chaos. Not to eliminate negative emotions, but to integrate them. Grief became a guest, not a trespasser. Anxiety, a hypervigilant friend who just needed better boundaries. Even rage was welcomed, given boxing gloves and a microphone. One popular therapy model, Feel and Deal, taught patients not to suppress emotions, but to duet with them. Sing with your sadness, they'd say. It has better pitch than you think. And amid all this, a quiet cultural transformation took hold. People stopped asking each other, "Are you happy?" and started asking, "What are you feeling?" And when someone said, "I don't know," it wasn't a failure, it was a beginning. Because to not know meant you were paying attention. Feeling again didn't make the world safer. It made it realer. The streets still had heartbreak. The skies still had storms. People still lost jobs, broke up, got ghosted, missed flights, burned dinner, stubbed toes. But now, instead of anesthetizing the experience, they turned it into something. A song, a joke, a story, a shrug. And over time, something miraculous began to happen. People stopped fearing sadness. They still hated it, of course. No one likes crying in the produce aisle or waking up with existential dread because the moon looked weird. But they no longer believed sadness would end them. It became part of the dance. The downbeat before the chorus. And the chorus, when it came, it was beautiful because it wasn't chemically guaranteed. It was earned. It was sometime around the 5th Global Feel Festival that the skeptics finally admitted, maybe, just maybe, the world had gotten it half right. The Feel Festival began as a cheeky counter-event to the Old World Happiness Summit, which had once featured panel discussions with phrases like optimism ROI and the future is joy. In contrast, Feel Fest had no sponsors, no dress code, and no VIP zones. It offered a week-long journey through the full emotional spectrum. Visitors could walk through curated zones, a heartbreak maze with whispered confessions piped through speakers, a scream room filled with china plates and baseball bats, a cuddle cavern manned by professional grandmas, and a dark corner where strangers simply stared at each other for 7 minutes and then walked away forever. Critics called it emotional Disneyland, but attendees, millions of them, called it life-changing. One young man said he finally forgave his father in the anger tent, while throwing chairs to the sound of primal drums. A retired teacher danced alone in the Joy Dome until her knees gave out, and she wept from a mix of gratitude and arthritis. A woman in her 70s stood at the grief fountain, reading aloud her husband's old postcards, tears rolling down her cheeks as strangers held her hands and said nothing at all. There were no gift shops, only journals. And still, Glee Tech tried one last time. They released a product called True Joy, a pill that, according to its packaging, allowed users to experience pure happiness, but only after passing through temporary sadness, fear, regret, and acceptance. It was, in effect, a simulation of the emotional journey, with a shortcut back to the high. It failed spectacularly. Users found the sadness too scripted, the regret too brief, and the final joy suspiciously similar to eating cake while high. Because by now, people could tell the difference. They knew when joy had roots, and when it was synthetic turf rolled out for emotional Instagram shots. Governments stopped legislating for happiness. Instead, they focused on emotional infrastructure. Public parks with screaming zones, libraries with grief counselors, schools with mandatory, awkward silences. Urban planners consulted poets. Zoning laws began requiring one unpredictable space per city block, just somewhere weird, messy, and uncurated, where people could gather and say, "What the hell is this?" and mean it as a compliment. Art history classes were revised. Students now studied not just the works, but the feelings behind them. Not, what did the artist mean, but what were they probably trying not to feel when they painted this? Music appreciation courses included breakdowns of breakups behind albums. Even cooking shows had emotion judges. "I taste unresolved grief in this lasagna," one critic said on a hit series titled Meals with Feels. And yet, amid all this cultural evolution, one question lingered like the aftertaste of a very intense therapy session. Was happiness ever supposed to be permanent? The general consensus? No. It was meant to visit, not move in. A lovely guest who comes unannounced, drinks too much, tells bad jokes, but reminds you why you cleaned the house in the first place. When happiness became the default, it lost its magic. When it became a reward, earned after mistakes, pain, and real risk, it shimmered again. You saw it in the smallest places. A woman in a coffee shop tearing up over a stranger's kindness. A group of teenagers screaming out lyrics they barely understood but felt in their bones. A tired man watching his child sleep, knowing he'd screwed up that day but somehow still deserved this moment of peace. None of them were blissed out, but all of them were alive. And then came the emotional endurance movement. It began in sports, of all places. Athletes realized that mental stamina wasn't just about suppressing nerves. It was about riding the wave. Tennis players who used to choke in finals now trained by reliving embarrassing childhood memories while practicing their serve. Swimmers competed in melancholy laps, where they had to complete races while listening to playlists designed to make them reflect on the impermanence of everything. Eventually, the concept spread to life itself. Instead of aiming for happiness, people began training for resonance, the ability to fully feel an emotion without being consumed by it. Emotional endurance coaches emerged. Not therapists, not life gurus, just emotionally literate Sherpas guiding people through the wilderness of their own hearts. Their slogan, "Don't seek better feelings. Seek better feeling." Old phrases were reborn. Chin up became lean in. Don't cry became cry well. Cheer up became, what does that sadness need right now? Language evolved. No one said, "I'm fine" anymore. That was a red flag. Instead, people got specific. "I'm overwhelmed but hopeful. I'm grieving with good snacks. I'm 5 seconds away from rage but also kind of amused about it." Even silence gained weight. Not the awkward kind, but the sacred pause. The breath between stories. The space where laughter and tears agreed to coexist without stepping on each other's lines. And perhaps most beautifully, relationships transformed. People stopped trying to fix each other's moods. Romantic partners learned to say, "Do you want advice, distraction, or just my presence?" Friends stopped giving pep talks and started giving space. Even strangers, in crowded places, developed a gentle radar for emotional energy. No one demanded constant sunshine anymore. A cloudy disposition didn't mean you were broken, it meant you were weathering something. And so, slowly, gently, Society stopped treating emotions like problems to solve and started treating them like seasons to endure, witness, and cherish. Because in the end, happiness isn't the point. Feeling is. The raw, ridiculous, inconvenient, glorious mess of being sentient in a world that's too loud, too bright, too fast, and somehow still worth loving. And the moment we gave ourselves permission to feel it all, not just the sweet, not just the calm, but the whole catastrophic carousel, that's when we remembered. We were never supposed to be happy all the time. We were supposed to be human. In the decade that followed the collapse of synthetic bliss as a cultural ideal, the world matured, not in a neat, moralistic fairy tale way, but like an old wine left in a questionable basement. Richer, weirder, and slightly unstable in the best way possible. The media landscape mirrored the shift. Gone were the sickly sweet sitcoms where every conflict resolved with a hug and a pun. Now audiences craved nuance, emotional tension, characters who didn't always grow. Sometimes they regressed, plateaued, or just sat with their shame like an uninvited house guest. Viewers celebrated these messy protagonists because they felt like people you might actually know. Or be. One acclaimed series, Mostly Okay People, ran for 10 seasons without ever answering the question, are they going to be all right? The finale ended mid-sentence, mid-cry, mid-laugh. Fans wept, not because it was sad, but because it felt like someone had finally put a camera inside the human condition and hit record. Meanwhile, comedy thrived. Not the old kind built on punchlines and pratfalls, but the kind that dared to sit in discomfort and roast it. Comedians joked about their therapy bills, their existential dread, their over-reliance on banana bread during emotional spirals. One viral special was just a woman on stage for 45 minutes reading her teenage diary aloud, while intermittently dry, heaving from embarrassment. The laughter wasn't just catharsis, it was connection. The audience howled not at her but with her, because her shame was, frankly, uncomfortably familiar. Even romance changed. Dating apps added filters for emotional fluency, can hold space for sadness, knows how to cry without making it about them, thinks conflict is growth, not doom. First dates became vulnerability editions. Forget job titles or hobbies. What really mattered was whether you could talk about the worst day of your life without flinching, or how you handled guilt, or what you did with your jealousy when your best friend got everything you wanted. People didn't look for perfect partners anymore. They looked for resonant ones. Relationships became less about constant joy and more about mutual emotional permission. The right to be a mess without losing love. One couple even renewed their vows by saying, I promise to sit with your fear and let it smell weird for as long as it needs. It trended for a week. Wedding planners began offering packages with personalized emotional weather reports. Today's forecast, partly joyful, chance of vulnerability, with scattered anxiety in the afternoon. But it wasn't all enlightenment and emotional jazz hands. There were still setbacks. Political movements tried to hijack emotion for control. Some governments weaponized grief, pumping propaganda through mourning rituals. Others tried to outlaw certain feelings entirely, labeling rage as social terrorism or despair as counterproductive sentiment. One nation famously arrested a man for performing existential dread in a public space. His only defense? I was standing still. In response, the Feel Rights Coalition formed. Their mission? Protect the inalienable right to emotional expression, no matter how inconvenient. Their rallies weren't just political, they were deeply personal. People shared their traumas at podiums, not to manipulate, but to witness. One rally ended with the crowd chanting not slogans, but the names of their buried emotions. Guilt, shame, hope, wonder, fear. Someone released doves. Someone else just screamed into a harmonica. At a global scale, the United Nations launched the Human Feeling Archive, a digital repository of recorded emotional stories from every culture. Not facts, not statistics, just memories. A widow in Ethiopia describing her husband's laugh. A teenager in South Korea whispering about her fear of disappointing her parents. A fisherman in Norway admitting that sometimes the ocean makes him cry and he doesn't know why. The archive became the most visited digital monument on Earth because it reminded us, again and again, that emotion was the only true common language. Not love, not hate, not peace, but the ability to feel and the courage to share it. Eventually, schools introduced courses on emotional time travel. The idea that feeling something fully now helps you remember it more vividly later. Students were encouraged to pause in the middle of joy and say, "I want to remember this." It became a sacred ritual. Birthdays, first kisses, standing ovations. Someone always whispered it. "I want to remember this." And just like that, memory grew roots. Grief rituals evolved too. Instead of simply mourning the dead, people mourned unlived emotions. Regret became a collective ceremony. Communities held burning disappointments, where people wrote down the feelings they'd never expressed and watched them vanish in flame and ash. Not to forget, but to release. Technology, once obsessed with optimization, finally got the memo. Apps no longer pinged you to meditate or breathe. They asked, "What are you feeling?" And they didn't suggest fixes. They just mirrored it back. "You said you feel lost. That's okay. Do you want to sit with that or explore it?" Some used AI to generate metaphors for your mood. "Your sadness today feels like a bookstore during a blackout." One user wrote back, "That's exactly it. Thank you." Then cried, then wrote a poem, then called their mom. And in all of this strange, stunning, nonlinear progress, one quiet truth settled over humanity like a soft, well-earned sigh. We had finally forgiven ourselves for being complicated. No more chasing the high of permanent cheerfulness. No more medicating away the middle notes of emotional music. No more pretending that life should feel like a commercial for breakfast cereal. We had grown into our feelings. We had made a home inside the storm. And for the first time in centuries, we stopped asking, "How can I be happy?" and started asking, "How can I be whole?" Because happiness, lovely as it is, was only ever the sugar on top. Wholeness, glorious, jagged, breathtaking wholeness, was the real feast. And so, the world learned to feast, not just on joy, but on sorrow, confusion, awe, awkwardness, fury, grief, wonder, and that weird flutter in your chest when a stranger smiles at you for no reason. We didn't eliminate sadness. We didn't cure heartbreak. We didn't build a utopia powered by hugs and biodegradable mood enhancers. What we built was messier, truer, heavier, and far more worth living in. Children began to inherit this new reality not as a burden, but as a gift. They didn't grow up hearing, "Don't cry." They heard, "Let it out. I'll sit with you." They weren't told to cheer up. They were taught to name the fog, describe the ache, trace the trembling. Classrooms had feel maps. Kids could point to zones like angry but not sure why, happy but guilty about it, and disappointed in myself for feeling disappointed. These weren't pathologies. These were weather reports, the forecast of being alive. And without the pressure to be constantly okay, they became resilient. Resilience, not the brittle, stoic kind where you grit your teeth and soldier on, but the supple, dynamic kind. The kind that bends without breaking. That cries and gets back up. That trembles and still chooses to try again. They weren't tougher. They were softer in the strongest sense of the word. A new art form emerged, emotional cartography. Artists began mapping internal landscapes. Not metaphorically, literally. People would sit for interviews describing their inner terrain. One man said his depression felt like a foggy mountain where every step echoes. A woman said her love felt like a city at night, chaotic, alive, unpredictable. These mental maps were turned into VR exhibits, allowing others to walk through someone else's mind. It was empathy made immersive. People paid good money to spend 20 minutes inside a stranger's heartbreak, and they emerged changed, not enlightened, not improved, just expanded. In quiet corners of the world, elderly folks began gathering to tell the emotional histories of their lives. Not their achievements, not their career highlights, just how they felt along the way. A woman in her 90s said, "Most of my life, I thought I was failing at happiness. Turns out, I was just passing through all the right emotions at the wrong speed." She smiled. And that's okay too. Religions flourished, not as empires of certainty, but as sanctuaries of feeling. Services became less about dogma and more about vulnerability. Worship wasn't an act of obedience. It was an act of emotional surrender. Congregants gathered not to recite, but to feel together. They cried for each other's loss. They shouted in collective rage. They sat in holy silence while grief made its quiet rounds. And what of science? It too evolved. Researchers no longer treated emotion as noise to be filtered out of the data. They saw it as a vital variable. Neuroscience embraced subjective variability. Psychiatry stopped pathologizing sadness and started studying its function, its wisdom, its stubborn refusal to be optimized. Even AI was redesigned, no longer tasked with mimicking humanity's best traits, but instead trained to recognize when a human didn't want fixing, just listening. The first emotionally aware AI was named Iris. She had no face, no voice, just a pulsing orb and a simple interface. She didn't cheer you up. She didn't analyze your tone. She simply asked, "Do you want me to understand, or just hold this with you?" Millions chose Iris over chatbots that gave answers. Iris gave presence. Someone once called her the silent friend I didn't know I needed. Another said, she made space for the ache. People stopped asking apps for advice. They asked for witnessing. Even architecture began to shift. Buildings were designed with emotion in mind. Rooms with acoustics that amplified quiet crying. Soft walls for leaning into. Nooks meant for feeling small. Cities adopted emotional zoning, not for noise or pollution, but for emotional tone. Need quiet sorrow? Head to the East Bridge at dusk. Need cathartic laughter? There's a corner in the downtown market where buskers just tell jokes about being misunderstood by their dads. And slowly, invisibly, something unmeasurable began to rise. Emotional trust, not just in others, but in ourselves. In our own capacity to handle the storm. To feel what must be felt without needing to solve it. People stopped reaching for the pill at the first sign of discomfort. They reached inward, or outward, or upward, but always through, never around. Because the era of sidestepping emotion was over. The shortcut had led us into a cul-de-sac of artificial cheerfulness. It had made life bearable, but it had also made it beige. Now, we painted with the full spectrum. Joy wasn't a goal. It was a side effect. A beautiful, erratic, unplannable guest. Sometimes it arrived drunk. Sometimes it came at funerals. Sometimes it stayed for days and then vanished mid-sentence. And that was okay. We didn't chase it. We hosted it. And when it left, we waved from the porch, knowing it would be back when we least expected. In the final analysis, the world didn't become happier. It became braver. And maybe that was the whole point. Not to be happy, but to be ready for whatever feeling arrived next. To open the door to rage, to delight, to longing, to heartbreak, and say, "Come in, I've made tea." Because when we stopped trying to feel good all the time, we started feeling everything. And that, strange as it sounds, finally made us whole. If this episode stirred something in you, if you felt seen, heard, or even just a little more human, then take a moment to share that feeling. Leave a comment, send it to a friend who needs to hear it, or just let yourself sit with the weight of it a little longer. And if you're brave enough to keep asking impossible questions with us, subscribe to What If Horizons. Because next week, we're diving into another strange, beautiful, and probably uncomfortable reality. Until then, don't chase the feeling, live it.